Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Let me ask you a question. When you hear someone say something racist, do you speak up? Do you point out why the comment is offensive? Do you come to the defense of the group or person being maligned? Or are you just silent? And is there ever a time when you should just let it go? Up next on Another View, a candid conversation with author, poet, and TED Talk phenom Clint Smith on the danger of silence and how we can stand together in a culture of fear. We begin our race. Let's talk about it discussion on Another View next, right after this news from NPR.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. A quick shout out to all the wonderful people in Gloucester who came out to meet me and Sandra Woodward and the rest of the WHR team last Friday. We had a great time at the Art on Main Gallery, where Sandra and I talked about our experiences with you, our radio audience. Everyone was so gracious. So, as my toddler cousin used to say, thank you for your hospitality. We really appreciate it. It was spring of 2015 when producer Lisa Godley and I approached management here at WHRV with our desire to host town hall conversations throughout Hampton Roads about race. And just about this time last year, we held our very first Race Let's Talk About It event. The topic was "The Flag is Down, Now What?" Since that time, we've held 3 additional community conversations on topics covering privilege, power, and difference, race and politics, and race and religion. Tomorrow, Saturday, October the 1st, we will hold our 5th community conversation about race. The topic is standing together in a culture of fear, and it will be held at the Boyd Dining Hall on the campus of Virginia Wesleyan College from 2:30 until 4. It's free and it's open to everyone, but we do need you to register. So please visit whro.org/talkaboutrace to sign up. And our town hall is a part of the One Love Festival, which is going on all day tomorrow from 1 until 9 p.m. at Virginia Wesleyan College. So today we begin the conversation on how to stand together in a culture of fear. And one way to do that is to examine the danger of silence. Our very special guest is Clint Smith. He's the author of Counting Dissent. He's also a teacher, poet, and TED Talk phenom whose talks, The Danger of Silence and How to Raise a Black Son in America, have been viewed by more than 4 million times. Hi, Clint.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
I am so excited about having you here today because obviously, hopefully people in our audience understand and know what TED Talk is. But in case they don't, can you explain a little bit about what that whole phenomenon is about first?
Yeah, so TED Talks are sort of talks that happen at a variety of conferences and get-togethers throughout the United States, North America, and the world. And they started, TED stands for Technology, Education, and Design. But they've kind of expanded over the last 10 years or so to include people who are experts in a myriad of fields that sort of tackle every social issue of the day. And so in March of 2014, they have sort of, there are different tiers. There's TEDx, which is independently organized TED events. Mm-hmm. There's TED Salons, which are sort of like more intimate one evening TED events. And then there's the TED Conference, which happens every year in Vancouver, right? Mm-hmm. And so I did in March of 2014, I applied for and participated in a TEDx conference at TEDx Manhattan, and it was a lot of the TEDx's are specifically themed, and so this one was specifically themed around the issue of food justice. And so I had been teaching high school English at that time, and so I taught in Prince George's County, Maryland.
I actually worked in Prince George's County, Maryland for the police department.
Okay, yeah.
I meant to tell you that, yes.
Prince George's County is a place near and dear to my heart. I was there for 3 years, but it has shaped me in ways that I think I'm only really still beginning to understand. Wow. And so a lot of my writing at that time was through the lens of my students and thinking about what it meant to teach in a community, a high poverty, predominantly Black and Latino community, in which my students were were constantly experiencing the implications of growing up in a like deeply impoverished, segregated, under-resourced neighborhood. And so I had never heard of the term food desert before. And a food desert, for those who don't know, is an area that does not have access to sort of like healthy foods, fresh produce, or grocery stores that afford them those sorts of things. And so in Prince George's County, it's classified by the U.S. Department of Agriculture as a food desert. And I realized that sort of on a personal level when I was there, and realized that there was no grocery store within like half a mile of my school, within a mile of my school, a mile and a half of my school. And so it became unsurprising when my students would come into class, you know, and having Coke and chips for breakfast. And I think that sometimes there can be this idea for a lot of people that like the reason that Black people have disproportionately poor health outcomes is because there's like they just make these decisions to eat poorly, but people aren't really looking at the sort of structural realities that shape what sort of food exists in what sorts of communities. And that if you have to hop on like 3 buses to go get some fruit, then certainly you're going to go to the 7-Eleven or the gas station and get what's available.
Something very close.
Which is to say, so I wrote a poem about that. I presented that at the TEDx Manhattan. It did well. And the organizer of that conference said, you should really apply to speak at a TED Salon event. And so I applied to speak at the TED Salon under the pretense that it was a sort of like tryout for the real TED. It was like a small get together, about 100 people. And they had, I think, 20 speakers who all did like 5 to 6 minute talks. And I went and I presented my piece, which was The Danger of Silence. But I wasn't I wasn't thinking that it was going to be put online. And so I did it. I was like, oh, that was fun. I enjoyed that. Met some really neat people. And then a month later, they sent me an email and it said, we'll be putting your talk online in the next 72 hours. Prepare your online presence. And I was like, I don't have an online presence. So I made a website really quickly. I think I had a Twitter, but I hadn't tweeted in maybe like 6 months. So I was like, racism is bad. And tweet. And
check it out.
You know, and then so it was really fascinating because that week was such an interesting moment in my own life. So that was, it went up in August of 2014. The beginning of that week, I was on the Washington, D.C. Poetry Slam team where I lived, and we had won the National Poetry Slam, which was a remarkable achievement. And to do so with like some of the people that I love most in this world was amazing. I left to begin graduate school at Harvard 2 days after that. So I moved from Washington, D.C. to Cambridge. My talk went up, or Mike Brown was killed, I think, within that same week in Ferguson. And then my talk went up 2 days after that. So I think what happened is that my talk went up, unfortunately, in a moment where people were looking for something to sort of like explain or illustrate and illuminate how they were feeling.
We pulled a part of your talk from The Danger of Silence, and I want to play that now, and then let's talk about it on the other side.
When Christian was beat up for being gay, I put my hands in my pocket and walked with my head down as if I didn't even notice. Couldn't use my locker for weeks because the bolt on the lock reminded me of the one I had put on my lips when the homeless man on the corner looked at me with eyes up, merely searching for an affirmation that he was worth seeing. I was more concerned with touching the screen of my Apple than actually feeding him one. When the woman at the fundraising gala said, "I'm so proud of you. It must be so hard teaching those poor, unintelligent kids," I bit my lip because apparently we needed her money more than my students needed their dignity. We spend so much time listening to the things people are saying that we rarely pay attention to the things they don't. Silence is the residue of fear. It is feeling your flaws gut-wrench guillotine your tongue. It is the air retreating from your chest because it doesn't feel safe in your lungs. Silence is Rwandan genocide. Silence is Katrina. It is what you hear when there aren't enough body bags left. It is the sound after the noose is already tied. It is charring. It is chains. It is privilege. It is pain. There is no time to pick your battles when your battles have already picked you. I will not let silence wrap itself around my indecision. I will tell Christian that he is a lion, a sanctuary of bravery and brilliance. I will ask that homeless man what his name is and how his day was, because sometimes all people want to be is human. I will tell that woman that my students can talk about transcendentalism like their last name was Thoreau, and just because you watch one episode of The Wire doesn't mean you know anything about my kids. So this year, instead of giving something up, I will live every day as if there were a microphone tucked under my tongue, a stage on the underside of my inhibition. Because who has to have a soapbox when all you've ever needed is your voice? Thank you.
Such powerful words and such emotion there. Why are people afraid? Why do they keep silent, Clint?
I think that it's really hard. It's really hard to be surrounded by a group of people, especially those who you have intimate relationships with, whether it be your family or your friends, and to hear someone say something that is not aligned with your values, and to have the courage in that moment where maybe everybody's laughing or when everybody's agreeing, to speak up and say, I don't agree with that. And I don't operate under any pretense that it's easy. And I think I have to make that clear when I'm sharing that poem or having these conversations, is that, when you're at Thanksgiving and Uncle Joe says something racist or something homophobic or something sexist, it's not easy in that moment to say something or to stand up for the people that you love who he or she or whoever is speaking about. But I think what we have to do is really sort of, it's an old adage, but that really notion of like treating others how you want to be treated. What if that person, if they were speaking about the Black community, if they were speaking about the gay community, if they were speaking about women, and there was somebody from that group in that room, what would you do? And if somebody were speaking poorly about you or the group that you are associated with, and you were there and a friend of yours or somebody you cared about didn't defend you, how would you feel? And I think that people really have to sort of like engage in that sort of radical empathy and think about like, what does it mean to, how does silence make us sort of complicit in a lot of the injustice that we see that's around us? Because I think part of the nomenclature that we have now is that, oh, well, like I didn't say anything or I didn't do anything, so it wasn't me. But if you allow like really harmful and violent discourse to sort of exist all around you without saying anything, then I think you're as much of the problem as anybody else.
Some people say, well, if I say something, then I'm just perpetuating. And this is something we hear about Another View often, because we discuss things from an African-American perspective. And some people say, well, what you're doing then is just continuing the divide. You're continuing the difference. But I'm asking you, do we need to talk about it so that we can get beyond the misunderstandings and the issues that people have between races, between sexuality, all of that? If we don't talk about it, will we ever make it better?
I think that part of what happens is that we either don't talk about it or we talk about it incorrectly, right? And so oftentimes the nature of my work is that I literally, as a writer, as an artist, as a researcher, as a teacher, I am committed to a sort of like platform of anti-racism, and that much of my work is committed to illuminating the history of racial inequality in this country. And sometimes people will be like, oh, you talk so much about race, like it's always about race. And I was like, I don't think that people really understand the like foundational way in which race has shaped our like contemporary lived experience, right? And so I always talk about, the first slaves came here in 1619. The Emancipation Proclamation was 1863. Civil War ended in 1865. The Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were 1964 and 1965. It's 2016 now. There were 300 plus years where Black people were legally, legislatively subject to dehumanization, discrimination, and violence from the state, from the federal, state, and municipal governments. Like it was legal to do so. There's only been 50 years of even a semblance of legal and legislative freedom in this country, right? And we can talk about the sort of like race-neutral policies that have very racialized implications with regard to mass incarceration, housing discrimination, and all these different things. But if you kick someone for 350 years and then stop kicking them and then look at them and say like, what's wrong with you?
Why are you upset?
Why are you upset? Why are you hurting? Why do you live in poverty? And not account for or not proactively seek to heal the violence that you did, we know that like that's not how healing happens, and that if this notion that like race doesn't matter anymore is like deeply ahistorical and doesn't reflect a lot of the policies that currently exist and a lot of the policies that have existed for a long time.
And if you don't talk, though, how you never get to also the emotion, because I know that a lot of this racism is systemic, and we get that, and we can legislate that away, and we can change laws and so forth. But what do we do about literally changing the hearts of people when it comes to race?
So I think something I always think about is and sometimes there can be these sort of false equivalencies between social movements. So I'm not, I want to preface this by saying I'm not equating the gay rights movement and the black rights movement. But I think it's interesting to look at the movement for gay rights and marriage equality specifically, and certainly, we can look at this country in totality, and there are a lot of people who are still deeply homophobic, a lot of people who are still struggling to come to terms with gay marriage and the rights that are now being afforded to the gay community. But I think it's undeniable how quickly there was a transition from in the sort of like popular discourse of like homosexuality being very taboo and kind of like, ooh, we don't talk about that, or I'm okay with it, but it should stay over there.
Stay over there.
To now where it is the law of the land that people, regardless of their sexual orientation, have the opportunity to marry. And I think part of that is because there was a huge effort in the gay community that people would start coming out. And so like people started coming out to their families, to their friends. And what you had was people all across the country who may have previously been against gay marriage and realized that they had people they loved and cared about who were gay. And I think what that sort of proximity, that social, emotional, and physical proximity to someone who was different, I think it like fundamentally changes the way that you think about an issue. And so when the issue with regard to black people is a bit different because we're 12% of the population. We often live in very segregated areas, but I think the more that people can commit themselves to establishing real and meaningful relationships with people who are different than them, and to disabuse themselves of these sort of like caricatures of different people that they have been inundated with their entire lives, I think that's when you start beginning to find movement along issues of Black Lives Matter, and people being okay to say Black Lives Matter instead of All Lives Matter, because they recognize that this is like there are people who they care about and love who are subjected to like inherent violence on an everyday basis.
Speaking of Black Lives Matter, because there are a lot of people who do respond that way. Well, all lives matter. From your perspective, explain what Black Lives Matter means.
Yes, so Black Lives Matter is an affirmation of what should be an indisputable fact in this country, but is not, and that it is that we live in a country in which Black lives, again, I sort of delineated the historical reality, but like Black lives have not mattered for the vast majority of this country's history, and that is like indisputable. And what we see now is very much the sort of residue and the sort of continued effects of a deep, long history of racial inequality in this country, and systemic racism in this country that now manifests itself in the form of police violence, now manifests itself in the form of people who are not even police, who consider themselves, an extension of the state, with the George Zimmermans and stuff, feeling like they have the right to execute someone because they feel threatened based on their stereotypes and their prejudices. And what Black Lives Matter is saying is that we do not want to live in a country in which we have to fear for our lives every time we step out of the door. And people will say, but all lives matter. Everyone is equal. Certainly. And like nobody is questioning that. But what happens, the example that people often use is you don't go to a rally for cancer and say, but like all diseases matter. Why are you sitting here rallying for cancer? Like all diseases matter. That would be ridiculous. That would be insensitive, and people would be deeply offended. And that's what happens when you say all lives matter. Black people are experiencing like a sort of unprecedented police violence. Black people, it is illuminated in a way that it has never been before. It is reflected of something that has been happening in this community for a long time, and Black people are tired. They're tired of living in segregated communities. They're tired of not having access to the same social benefits that their counterparts do. They're tired of attending subpar schools. They're tired of living in poverty. I mean, the list can go on. And people are now saying that like we matter. And if you say all lives matter at a Black Lives Matter rally, when there's like a specific focus on trying to heal something that's going on in a specific community, you sound like someone who is going to a cancer rally and saying all diseases matter.
So I read an article that you did in New Yorker, I believe, and it was about your experience with police in New Orleans at your aunt's house. And when I talk to people in the community a lot, sometimes they say, Well, all that you are teaching black children or young black men in particular is to be polite to police. From reading your article, you see something a little different than just being polite. Talk about that experience and how the experience of black people and police, why that is such a hot button issue right now.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's an issue that has been an issue for many, many years. It's that, and what's, I said sort of unprecedented police violence. In many ways, I probably should take that back, because this is something that's been happening in black communities. I was going to say,
because the question is it because now we see it more?
It is now we see
because
it, right?
With social media and so forth.
So now people have iPhones, people have Twitter accounts, people have Facebook with which to document so much of what has been happening for a long, long time. And so it is not that it is happening more necessarily. It is that it is being broadcast in a way that it never had the ability to before. And so, I think that it's important to sort of recognize the ways in which that history has shaped our current moment. And I forgot your question.
Well, my initial question was in terms of why when a black family talks about what to do when a young man in particular is stopped by police, that's more than just teaching them to be polite.
No, certainly.
You're actually talking about saving your life.
No, this is real. And I think that this is something that many people don't consider. And I think about it as the sort of like pedagogy of black parenting, right? And this idea that black parents grow up having to, or their children grow up in homes where their parents are making decisions about almost sort of like sacrificing parts of their child's childhood to make sure that they can come home at night. And so I grew up in a very mixed race, mixed income community. It was like the Disney Channel, there were black friends, white friends, Asian friends. It was one, we'd ride bikes. It was wonderful. And my dad was like, I think it's wonderful that you have such a diverse group of friends, but you have to understand that the implications of like silly childhood decisions that you all make might be very different for you than they might be for your friends, right? So when you guys are like, just it's nighttime and you want to hop over this fence to go play ball in this park that's otherwise locked, what it means for a policeman to see a black boy hopping over a fence at night is something very different than what it means for him to see a white child doing that. And when you're a kid, you don't really understand that. I was kind of like, oh, you're the mean dad, you're the strict dad. Why can't you be more like Tommy's dad? And be like, Tommy doesn't live in this house. But you sort of don't come to terms with even like that it has nothing to do with you. Really, it has nothing to do with your behavior. And I think a moment that really made that real and concretized that was when Tamir Rice was killed. A 12-year-old boy in Cleveland, Ohio, playing with a toy gun in a park, not bothering anyone, not threatening anyone, in an open carry state. So it wasn't even a real gun, but even if it was, it is a state in which it is not illegal to carry a gun. And they didn't have time to even know how old he was or anything. And so it goes back to conversations that my parents had with me about like not playing with water guns outside, not playing with BB guns outside, not running around at nighttime. And it very much made real something that was previously an abstraction.
And even when you became an adult, when you were at your aunt's house and you were stopped by the police, you remember that story?
Yes.
But the fear. Talk about your feelings, I guess, when that happened.
Yeah, and so part of what I wanted to try to illustrate in that piece was how even in sort of normal everyday interactions with police, because of the sort of proliferation of violence that exists, the stress level, that piece was largely about sort of health, right? And so the level of stress that black people feel when like literally seeing a police car has like very real implications for one time. Like this sort of decreases the amount of years that you live in a very real physiological way. And so this was right after Philando Castile. This is right after Alton Sterling, and right before Dallas that this happened. And so, the tensions were at a sort of unprecedented level, especially in my lifetime. And a policeman pulled up when I was at my aunt's house, and the alarm was going off at her house, and no one was home. And so this police pulled up, saw a black 20-something-year-old man walking away from a house that's alarms is going off, and my immediate thing was like, he's going to think I'm robbing this house. What do I do? Should I pull out my phone to film? If I reach for my phone, is he going to think I'm reaching for a gun? I'm like, and there's so much. All of this is playing in my head, and I was so anxious. And I was just like, if I were white, this would never, I would never have to think about this. But the fact that black people are always having to think about what it means to protect their bodies takes like a real physical toll and has like deep health ramifications proven by like study after study after study.
We were talking in our production meeting with our audio engineer and the intern, and they were two African American males, and they were talking about how when they see a police car, they automatically take their foot off the accelerator. They will turn off and go to another street or whatever. And I think it's difficult especially based on the calls that we get sometimes, difficult for people who are not African American to understand why that is so ingrained that as Victor said, he said, you don't even think about it. It's just an automatic reaction.
No, I think it's difficult to explain what it means to wake up almost every week now and to see people who look like you, people who could be your brother, your father, your even the black women who experience police violence, your daughter, your mother, like people who look like you, who could be your family, who could be your neighbors, being killed on cameras, broadcast for the world. And I mean, it takes such a real toll, and it inevitably is going to shape the way you think about the very people who you see continuing to kill other black people. And so I think that, you know, part of what I always tell people, it's interesting, you know, I feel deeply grateful. I go to, you know, one of the best schools in the world. I'm getting a doctorate from Harvard. And sometimes people can be like, oh, well, so you made it. Like you transcended race. Like
you're not like those other black people.
you like move to a place where like race doesn't matter anymore because you have such a high level of education. And what I have to tell people is like, that's just not true. I still get followed in stores in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I still have a difficult time catching a cab. I still, you know, I mean, racism manifests itself in all sorts of subtle ways, regardless of your income, regardless of your education level. And I think it's important to disabuse people of that notion that, like, if black people simply work harder, they can escape racism. But racism is the foundation upon which this country was built. It is inextricably linked to the history of our nation. And that doesn't go away simply because you have a degree behind your name.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about ways we can stand together in a culture of fear as part of our Race Let's Talk About It initiative. Our special guest is the author of Counting Dissent. He's also a poet, teacher, and TED Talk presenter, Mr. Clint Smith. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. So do you speak up, or are you one who prefers to stay silent when you hear bigotry, discrimination, racism? 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. So you work with young men incarcerated. Incarceration is your thesis for your doctorate, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you've been working with them on creative writing and so forth. And I read that you say that they've taught you something.
Yeah.
What have they taught you?
Yeah. So for context, I'm a third year doctoral student, and my area of study is the sort of relationship between education and incarceration. And so thinking about the sort of three tiers of what education looks like, how education can be used as a means to prevent people from being incarcerated, the sort of educational opportunities that people are presented or not presented with when they are incarcerated, and to what extent people who are formerly incarcerated are disenfranchised and left out of having access to get educational opportunities. And so I've been teaching at a prison in Norfolk, Massachusetts for the last 2 years, and I teach creative writing, so fiction, nonfiction, poetry. And when I first began teaching there, I had to really confront in a real way that was very uncomfortable for me a lot of the like deeply embedded biases and prejudices and sort of unconscious presumptions that I made about these men that I was working with, that I made about their intellect, that I made about their drive, that I made about their commitment, that I made about their humanity. And I think I was quickly disabused of so many of the pathologies that I had been inundated with, because in our sort of collective discourse and in the media, the way that we think about prison is that you sort of like lock them up, throw away the key. These are bad people.
Done.
Yeah, these are bad people who've done bad things. They have they should not exist in our society, and they should be punished and left out. And so we either ignore them or like dehumanize them. And part of what spending so much time in the prison is going back to that idea of proximity. I mean, I think I like established meaningful relationships with people who have been, I was working with 40, 50, 60-year-old men who have been in prison since they were 17, 18, 19 years old. Wow. And I was thinking about my students, and I was thinking about, like, I taught 18-year-old kids, and I cannot imagine what it would mean for, like, them to be punished for the rest of their lives, because I was working with men who were serving life sentences for something they did when they were like just knuckleheads. And that's not to say that, these men did not do bad things, but it is to say, to what extent is it beneficial to our society to keep a 60-year-old man locked away in prison for something he did when he was a child? And is that benefiting public safety? Is that benefiting the person? Or is that just us sort of like engaging in a deep retribution that's not beneficial to anyone? And they have taught me so much about really ensuring that I am always challenging my own biases and my own assumptions. And they're some of the most brilliant people that I've ever met. I mean, they are amazing in that their intellect is so wide-ranging, and they're deeply smart in a sort of traditional way, but they also bring a different sense of intelligence because they have an unprecedented amount of time to like sit with their own thoughts. And so there's a deep level of reflection and sort of self-reflexivity that exists with them that I've never seen.
So you talked about proximity and making sure that's one way we can stand together in a culture of fear. Give us a couple of more, and then we're going to go to the phones. The phones are lit up.
Oh, wow.
But what I mean, if you live in an area where you are segregated, I mean, you rarely run into someone of another race, or you rarely run into someone of a different socioeconomic situation and so forth. How do you start that conversation so that we can stand together?
Yeah, I think that part of what you have to do is to look at what sort of choices you are making in your social life that is perpetuating a stratification and the segregation that exists, and in what ways you are seeking to interrupt that. And I mean, we make choices all the time about the restaurants we go to, about the parks we go to with our kids, about the churches that we attend, about the schools that we send our kids to, about the sort of community service and things that we do. So I think that there are opportunities all over the place and all the time to engage with people who are not like us, and to visit communities that are not like our own. And I think that it really is the only way that I think that we can, again, disabuse ourselves of the stereotypes we have of so many people. And that has happened for me in like really profound way. I mean, and going back to the LGBTQ community, I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up in a community in which, in the 90s, when like homophobia was like something you just like, it was not,
and especially in the Black community.
Certainly. And I realized that like I had a lot of really problematic views, and it wasn't until I established meaningful relationships with people who were gay, who were lesbian, who were trans, that I felt that it sort of made real and made so deeply human and disabused me of like all of these really problematic pathologies that I had. And now I think that I am more able to effectively advocate for people in the queer community, for the LGBTQ community, because I love people who are a part of that community, and that they are close and dear friends of mine, and I would never want them to not feel like they have the full rights in this world as anyone else. And I hope that many of them would do the same for me as a Black person in this country. And I think once we recognize the sort of like interplay and intersectionality of our marginalized identities, and we make a decision to sort of uplift one another, then we start creating a very different world.
Okay, let's go to the phones. Mark joins us from Norfolk. Hi, Mark, you're on the air.
Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Look, I'm enjoying the conversation. Ms. Lee, you asked a question about, what can we do to make, change people's heart. Mm-hmm. And we don't have that capacity. As a human being, we just don't have that capacity to do that. And I just think we've wasted so many years and decades of trying to make people love us. And that's impossible. That can't happen. And the second thing is that we don't talk about the power and the psychology of Willie Lynch, what he put in place, hundreds of years ago, and how that is still playing out today. And lastly, he mentioned about the gentleman in prison, is that the lions are in prison. It's the lions who will not conform to status quo. It's the lions that have courage and fear to rail against the system, so therefore they're more subject to be disciplined and locked up. And that's pretty. I have more to say, but I'll just leave it there.
Okay, you just dropped a whole load for us here to unpack, so we will try to do that. Thank you, Mark, for your call. Do you believe that hearts can't be changed, that we can't do that?
I've had my heart changed, and I think that part of what we have to do is recognize that these, like, social movement and social change doesn't happen overnight. I think that, Brian Stevenson, who's one of my favorite, he's an attorney based out of Alabama. He runs the Equal Justice Initiative. He does incredible work around racism and people in prison. He has this thing where he says, we look back at the civil rights movement as if it were this 3-day festival,
exactly.
And we look back and we say that
years.
on day 1, Rosa sat down on the bus. And day 2, Martin had a dream. And day 3, we all drink lemonade. We all vote Kumbaya. And that's so, I think that is really how we think about the history of the civil rights movement and many social movements over the course of history. And it's so wrong. The Montgomery bus boycott was 1955. Voting Rights Act didn't happen until 1964 and 65, So, that work was happening obviously much longer before 55 and continued to happen after 65. But like, changing the hearts and minds of people isn't something that happens overnight. And I think that I think you have to separate. I think there are some people who, no matter what the evidence, no matter what the social science, no matter what they see, they will believe deeply and have deeply prejudiced views. But I think that there are an entirely different group of people who just don't know. I think that, again, they don't exist in any close proximity to other black people. And all they know of black people is what they see on the news, what they see, and the assumptions and stereotypes they have. But I think that we have to recognize that there is a group of people for whom there are notions of race relations in this world can change, but we have to sort of be proactive on that front.
And we have to start somewhere. Jason joins us from Virginia Beach. Hi, Jason. You're on the air.
Hey, how you guys doing today?
All right. How are you?
Good.
I love the conversation. I really appreciate it, and I just want to make a couple comments real quick.
Sure.
For starters, as a man in my 40s with a purple mohawk, if I was at a house where the alarm was going off, I would feel threatened if a police officer showed up, and I would respond accordingly. Laying down on the ground, whatever I needed to do, I would make sure that I'm safe and let them know that I'm surrendering and understand that they are in control of the situation. So it's not necessarily a black or white thing. So that's one thing. It goes across the board, depending on the situation. And number two is I've said this so many times, I really feel like a large part of the issue with especially young black men in our society has a lot to do with what they're fed by family members, as far as there's almost like this predisposition of you have to be scared and defend yourself when you're in the situation where a police officer is talking to you. And I really feel like it might be an unconscious response where you're so scared and uncomfortable and worried about your life that you overreact, and that makes police respond in a way that they feel like you're a threat. And I don't think it's necessarily as much a black or white thing as it is how you respond. In the area that I live in, I pull over every time I see, especially a young black man pulled over by police, I will pull over and watch the situation. And there's so much exaggerated movement and arm flailing and over talking that I feel like they're responding to what they feel like is a threat. And it's not necessarily a black or white thing as much as it is, this is the way you're acting, and you're going to be met with that
Okay, Jason,
exactly the way you're acting.
we
And
get your point, and I don't mean to
hip-hop-
cut you off. It's just that we don't have much time, and I want to make sure we can get to some other calls. That is a area where I think that just black and white people just see it very, very differently.
Yeah, I appreciate Jason sharing his perspective. So I think that you can look at this sort of empirically, and we look at the social science and look at the research that like demonstrates that black people are far more likely to be subjected to violence during routine traffic stops. That black people are far more likely to be arrested, even though they're no more likely to have drugs or contraband with them. And I think that what we see example after example of, we've seen in the last month countless videos that demonstrate clearly that black men were shot having not done anything. The video from Charlotte just came out, and he was literally walking in the opposite direction. The video from Tulsa came out, and his hands were up. I mean, so I think this idea that like the reason that black people are being killed is because they're flailing or making exaggerated actions, like isn't backed up by the anecdotal evidence that we're seeing, and isn't backed up by the social science. So I understand why he might think that, because I think that is a notion that is like part of a narrative we've been fed, but like the evidence simply doesn't back that up.
Okay. Warren joins us from Norfolk. Hi, Warren. You're on the air.
Hi, Miss Lee.
Hi.
My first spoken sentence can dictate whether I can be heard or not. When adrenaline runs to my earlobes and my knees because I've heard something that makes me boil, it is critical that I use the first sentence to either ask for permission or just to say, there's something that I really want to say. Can you hear it? Would you listen? I offer this because it's taken me 40 years to realize that what I say first can really dictate how what I say afterwards, in terms of let's talk about it and all of that, whether it succeeds or not. And thank you for this conversation.
Thank you very much for your call, sir. I appreciate it. So I guess he's saying in terms of if we're going to talk about race or we're going to talk about something difficult, how we approach it makes a difference.
Definitely. And I kind of have harked on this a bit, but I think that like history is so important. And I think that part of what we don't understand is like the history of this moment. So an issue that I always bring up is the New Deal. Right. And so the New Deal, what we're taught in our American history courses is that the New Deal is the thing that has created the contemporary middle class. It is the thing, the FDR signed these series of legislative acts that made all of these social benefits available to people after the Great Depression to pull them up. After the war, soldiers coming back and literally built and made an entirely new socioeconomic infrastructure in this country. What we don't talk about is that part of those policies is that black people were inherently left out of having access to the benefits of the New Deal, right? So black people didn't have access to Social Security. They didn't have access to the GI Bill to go to college. They didn't have access to minimum wage protection. They didn't have access to housing mortgages. And so you have the thing that literally created social mobility for millions of families across the country, in which like millions of black families did not have access to. And what that means is that like intergenerational wealth, like when you can buy a home and like have that asset be built, that becomes something that you can like you pass on to your kids, or they can sell and they have that money. But if you never were able to buy a home, you weren't allowed to buy a home, you could only rent, then you have nothing to pass down to your kids. And I think, we often look back and people will say like, oh, well, slavery is over. That was so long ago. But what I try to tell people, I was like, this is stuff that was happening in the 20th century. This is stuff that's still happening now, right? Housing discrimination and redlining is pervasive, right? Throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and in many ways, in a sort of more subtle ways, even now, like real estate lenders wouldn't give mortgages or even show houses to black people in certain neighborhoods because they didn't want them to buy there.
I'm reading The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson.
Yeah.
And when you read that story of the migration of African Americans to the North,
right,
and what happened to them in Chicago and in New York and in Baltimore and all these big cities, of how neighborhoods literally would bomb their homes or pick up their houses and move them
Yeah.
rather than have black people buy the house.
No,
I mean,
it is
it's a phenomenal read, and it just brings home again what has been happening in this society and how now we're trying to move beyond that, but it's not going to happen overnight, as you said. Let's go to John in Virginia Beach. Hi, John. You're on the air.
How you doing?
Okay.
Okay, first I'd like to say, Mark, that was awesome, the caller. And then Jason, it's about black and white, basically. It's about control. The thing that I see that we need to do different is we need to stop protesting. I mean, it's not that era anymore. What we need to do, if there's a problem with the police, like I tell my young brothers all the time, then you become a police officer and you make more black faces instead of worrying about a white cop that's in fear of a black guy because we talk with hand movements because we may be tired of being pulled over for the 15th time in 2 weeks. You know, it's all about you becoming more active in your community and in your surrounding environment. It's not about begging white people to take care of you. It's not about begging them to treat you the same. I mean, if you treat each other better, then we will all become better. It's about
Okay,
unity.
John. Thank you so much. I'm trying to get to as many calls as we can. I appreciate your call. You want to respond to John?
Yeah, I appreciate John's call. I think I'll push back a little bit. I think that protest is necessary. I think the reason that we have seen some of the changes that we have in different communities in terms of like who their district attorney is, what sort of policies they have with regard to use of force in policing, body cameras, and not to say that those things solve the problem at all, but I think that what protests have done, the purpose of protest is to illuminate a problem, right? The purpose of protest is not to solve the problem. The purpose of protest is to make clear that there is an issue that is affecting many people, and again, I think that it is important. I think this is the era to continue protests. And again, I think that it reflects this sort of misunderstanding we have of how protests have happened over time. And with regard to the police officers, I think we certainly need more black police officers. I would agree on that front. But I also think it's important for us to recognize that like a black police officer is still part of a very corrosive institution, and that like they are become, when they are police officer, a tool of a group that is like enforced white supremacy.
Yeah, because in fact, there have been black police officers who have been the ones who pulled the trigger.
Right. No,
so when
exactly.
they're in that environment, and it comes back again to training and to ways that policing is done. I believe we only got a couple minutes left. I want to talk about Counting Dissent.
Yes.
Tell me about it.
Counting Dissent is my new collection of poetry, and so it has some of the work that is online and that you've heard. It is largely wrestling with the sort of marathon of cognitive dissonance that is to be a black person and grow up as a young black child in this country. And so it's a sort of coming of age story about some of my ideas and my upbringing, and trying to, again, at the beginning of the show, I spoke about holding sort of dualities, and part of what the book is thinking about is the violence that black people experience. But the other thing, what the book is thinking about, is like the profound joy and laughter and happiness that exists as in being a member of the black community. That was such a huge part of my childhood. We are not singularly defined by the things that kill us. We are not singularly defined by the violence that we experience. And that, I want to think as much about Maze and Frankie Beverly playing at the cookout and watching my parents dance to that song, as much as I also need to think about, Mike Brown being killed. And like both of those are a very real part of my lived experience. And I wanted to write a book that tried to capture both of those. And so the book is now out. It's available on Amazon. It's available on my website, Clint Smith III, ClintSmith3rd.com. And on social media, you can follow my work, Clint Smith III on Twitter as well.
Fantastic. I have one quick question I want to ask you because I'm really curious. Do you think that millennials perceive Gen Xers and baby boomers differently in terms of how race is dealt with? In other words, do you think that maybe they think Gen Xers and baby boomers are way maybe too sensitive to what's going on with race in this country versus them, because they grew up in a way that you were able to have multicultural friends and so forth?
Yeah.
We got 3 minutes left.
Yeah, I think that there can often be a lot made of this sort of dissonance or perceived dissonance between especially like civil rights movement leaders in this era and that era. I think that it is undeniable that the way that Black social justice leaders think about their work now is very much built upon those who laid the groundwork before. I think that part of what is happening now is that millennials and Black people who are thinking about Black Lives Matter are trying to be more expansive in who they're advocating for. And right, so thinking about this idea of intersectionality and saying that, like, you know, part of, in the civil rights movement, it was led by like Black church-going Reverend straight men. And what you see now is like this movement is being led by like many women. It's being led by many in the queer community. It's being led, it is addressing issues across lines of sexual orientation, across lines of race. You see Black Lives Matter partnering with the sort of Native American struggle in the Dakotas, partnering with the undocumented immigrant struggle in the Latino community. And I think that recognizing the sort of relationship between many people who are marginalized and trying to sort of uplift all of us and emancipate all of us is something that everybody's become a lot more committed to.
So you're going to be at Virginia Wesleyan College this evening.
I will be there
at 7 p.m. and people will have a chance to just come out. That is open to the community, by the way. And your talk is at 7 p.m. and I'm looking to see where exactly it is located. It's at the Convocation Center, I believe. Is that correct? At the Convocation Center on the campus of Virginia Wesleyan College. Clint Smith, it has been such a pleasure talking with you. You are just a breath of fresh air, I think. And I just wonder, give one word of encouragement to people as we all try to figure this thing out.
Yeah. So something that I think about a lot is that struggle is not something we do for ourselves, right? I think that sometimes people can say, like, if we don't see the fruits of our labor tomorrow or in our lifetime, then it wasn't worth it. And I think what we have to remember is that this is something much bigger than us. That, like, W.E.B. Du Bois back in the early 20th century, late 19th century, was talking about the right for African Americans to vote, you know, before he ever saw that come to fruition. Ida B. Wells was saying that Black men shouldn't be lynched before she ever saw an anti-lynching bill. Does that mean that because they didn't see the fruits of their work, that their work wasn't worth it? No, of course not. But I think what we have to do is be a lot more expansive and take a sort of larger look and say that even if we don't see the end of police violence in our lifetime, even if we don't see the end of mass incarceration in our lifetime, we have to work toward a world in which those things will exist, so our children or their children can live in that sort of world.
Thank you so very much for joining us. And if you'd like to hear more of Clint's perspective on race, hatred, discrimination, and how we can create a more peaceful and inclusive society, attend his talk tonight from 7 until 9 at the Batten Convocation Center on the campus of Virginia Wesleyan College. It is free and open to everyone. Then plan to join us as we continue this conversation during our Race Let's Talk About It Town Hall. It's tomorrow from 2:30 until 4 at the Boyd Dining Hall on the campus of Virginia Wesleyan, and as also a part of the One Love Festival. There's still time to register. Go to whro.org/talkaboutrace, and a very thank you to Virginia Wesleyan College and the Fort Monroe Authority and the One Love Festival for their support in this initiative. Next week, we kick off a special NPR project called What It Means to Be an American. We'll answer the question from an African American perspective. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Victor Bowen is our audio engineer, and Nicholas Thomas answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Thanks for listening, everyone, and let's get together again next Friday at noon for another view.